Hello, welcome back to another episode of Fear and Loathing in the Windy City. Right, we're here to talk about the Chicago machine, Chicago politics, its history, present, and perhaps immediate future in regards to the Not Me, Us movement that is currently doing all it can to elect Bernie Sanders to be president. Chicago machine here, well known for our first topic of discussion today, Al Capone. Um, Chicago has a history and a reputation for being quite corrupt, quite violent, and quite ominous and spooky. If you watch any Martin Scorsese's movies, I think a lot of the culture, a lot of the over-the-top tropes that he uses, you associate maybe with the Italian mob or the Chicago mob. We have seen, we are just talking about Boardwalk Empire, where Martin Scorsese took a stab at many different dealings of organized crime from New Jersey, Atlantic City, having always historical fiction, very dramatized, but where he focused a lot on the rise of Al Capone and his war on police. You know, and then he did The Irishman, which is on Netflix now, where you get to see someone that paints houses. This is actually an ongoing thing in Chicago, where this book, a former hitman for the mob in a retirement home, just shared that he was the one that shot Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa, right? And that became the
Really?
book. We paint houses. I paint houses, and which became the movie, The Irishman. All of this overly dramatized, of course. All of this with Hollywood actors, with one-liners, with dramatic music. Not the way that it happens in real life, but all based on real events, on a real culture that is fomented within a lot of immigrant working class Rust Belt cities, specifically, of course, Chicago, and a township of Cicero, which will be the topic, the main focus for tonight.
I'm glad you're talking about Cicero because, when I hear about Cicero, I can't help but, because we were talking about Boardwalk Empire before the show started.
Right.
And, granted, fantastic series. And with Cicero, we can't help but think of the early days of good old Al Capone and all that other good stuff.
Al Capone, right, famously got started in the township of Cicero. He joined the Five Points gang as a teenager, went on to be a bouncer for organized crime and clubs, had a reputation for being a little flashy, for being a bit of a tough guy, got that scar on his face early on.
Yeah.
Did not care for the nickname Scarface, but definitely his people that feared him did refer to him that way now and then. And he eventually became a driver for John Torrio, who was the crime boss, the Italian crime boss of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
He eventually took over his bootlegging operation. That
During
was
the height of Prohibition as well.
during the height of Prohibition. People don't give Al Capone. The mythos of Al Capone, I think, make him seem like this big boss bulldog that just took over the city. He was definitely a tough guy, and he definitely understood power dynamics and being on top. But what people don't understand is that there were so many gangs in
Yeah.
Chicago. There's tons of gangs.
Right.
But unlike New York, that has a reputation for always being fragmented by different warring clans, Chicago's had many warring clans for a very long time. What made it different was following Al Capone. They kind of went underground.
Well, see, for him, Al Capone, what he liked the media attention.
He did.
And it's kind of hinted at, even with, I know there's a difference between fiction and then reality, but even Boardwalk Empire acknowledged the fact that Al Capone, he was not shy of being on, not on television, but being talked about on the radio, being talked about in the newspapers. And I find it funny, especially in that one scene in Boardwalk Empire where he has to correct a news reporter. This is how you say my name correctly when you write about me. Because usually you would assume that if you were part of a criminal organization, you don't want to be talked about.
was
Al
the street,
Capone,
like,
he went to the reporter and said, "No, this is how you spell my name. This is what I do. If you're going to write about me, do it correctly."
And I mean, that's what people remember about
Right.
him. Almost 100 years later, he was a larger than life figure. He was only 30. No, he was only 25
Right.
when he completely took over John Torrio's operation,
Right.
and eventually muscled his way to the top of all organized crime in Chicago. Now, when we talk about organized crime, it's very important to we talk are specific about what they're doing. because Al Capone was able to rise in that environment, able to rise to stardom.
Right.
Because the number one moneymaker for organized crime at the time was prohibition of a controlled substance, in this case, alcohol.
Yeah. Which was a horrible decision that was made. I mean, none of these criminal organizations would exist were it not for that horrible decision of prohibition.
Yeah.
I mean, they would not even have a fraction of the power that they did during the 30s.
And I'm glad you brought up Boardwalk Empire, because I know it's a TV show, I know it's just historical fiction, but I loved that the show began with Nucky Thompson, which is, a homage to Nucky Johnson,
Yes.
who was a real treasure in New Jersey, opening with a celebratory party with all of his political friends for the good of prohibition, for the good of the country's health, and for how much money they were all going to make, because they knew exactly what they were going to do. They're like, people aren't going to stop drinking, but the religious people want it, and oh my God, if we made it illegal and we controlled it all, I mean, we control the cities.
Right. But let this be a lesson. Let this be a lesson about anything in regards to people, humans. If people want something, they are going to do it. No religion, no government institution, no policy, nothing in stone is going to stop a person from wanting to buy sex, drugs, alcohol. And let's face it, because I watched that Ken Burns documentary on prohibition, and yeah, they showed like what kind of drinks, like since no longer they had like a list of appropriate drinks to have with meals, and I'm looking at the Italian meals, like nothing with red wine, and that's like sacrilegious. Like, I love red wine, and if I'm gonna eat a nice Italian meal, I'm gonna have a glass of red wine. I guess in Prohibition 1930s, I'd be behind bars. I mean, it was ridiculous, and the amount of corruption those in the law enforcement agencies were being corrupt. I mean, it got to the point to where no one cared, and with somebody like Capone, he was able to profit off this and create a huge financial empire. And it wasn't the murders or the crime, the criminal, some of the shady dealings that brought down Al Capone. It was tax evasion.
Right.
Tax evasion brought down Al Capone. And just a quick just comment, and I want to return back to you, but
please.
I love the movie Untouchables, but it has its moments. It has its moments, but remember this: Elliot Ness wasn't really the main person that brought down Capone. Okay, I mean, granted, it's presented that way.
And he turned into a drunk after.
Yeah, so then there you go.
Which makes the last line Kevin Costner says in the movie just that much more awful. But yeah, sorry, Fed, your hero's a shit. And again, just to rotate back, because I wanted to start with Al Capone because we're talking about Cicero, we're talking about corruption, but we're talking about the culture of corruption. And I think we're going into 2020, and I started the show with the interest of how much gaslighting, misinformation, and hot air will be, so I just decided to add to it early on. But people revered Al Capone and what he was able to do for a lot of working class communities. He opened soup kitchens. He was dubbed a modern day Robin Hood. It wasn't
He was very generous.
He was generous with his money. He loved the attention.
Yeah.
It was, again, he was someone in his late 20s that got more power than he ever thought he would get. And it went out to his head, and he became a kingpin. It wasn't until after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, where they shot 7 people in broad daylight, in open daylight, that there was a public outcry against Al Capone and a desire to see him brought down, eventually on tax evasion charges. He was 33 years old when he would eventually be in prison. He almost stopped being the boss immediately after that. He wouldn't, he'll go on to be in jail for about 8 years and then live on like another, I haven't written it down here, like another 7 years after that. He died when he was 48 of syphilis. His mind kind of gone. And still, him going away was dubbed a big victory by the federal government. It was like a big reasoning for the need of something like the FBI, a federal organization that could cross state lines, like a giant federal police force. Unfortunately, though, Al Capone going away didn't stop organized crime at all in Chicago. What it did was make all of these warring clans in Chicago that had been unified under Al Capone's celebrity and violence decided, we're not going to do what Al Capone did. His notary is what brought him down, him bringing attention to himself. So we're all going to keep things quiet, and we're going to stop with the open violence. There was a unified code, and I recommend the book by Gus Russo, The Outfit. He has a lot of good in-depth research books, but The Outfit focuses specifically on Chicago after Al Capone goes to jail. a lot of his lieutenants will end up taking power. There was really no central power. So a lot of these warring clans kind of running the same operation Al Capone had, working on prostitution, on labor union racketeering, and on gambling. Things that the police, either looked away or participated in themselves as a level of control. Using these small money-making operations allowed organized crime in Chicago to stay hidden from the FBI, to stay underground from the press, to control small communities, especially small immigrant communities, throughout the history of urban America. And it really, created a symbiotic relationship with our political system, which I think is a lot of the draw to a lot of the historical fiction that Scorsese jumps on. You have Nucky Johnson, treasurer turned gangster. You have, Jimmy Hoffa, supposed to be a union president, with a lot of notary. We don't have those kind of figures anymore. At the time, how tied were they to organized crime? How much did the public were aware of that? How much did the public give them a pass?
Yeah.
How much did the public think Jimmy Hoffa and his Teamsters? I hope the FBI doesn't find anything on you. Like, America had that in its DNA since the FBI first founded.
Well, I would say I think even looking after Al Capone's era as being the boss of the city of Chicago as well as granted the Midwest, but there was the point of okay, people wanted drugs, people wanted the legal materials, they wanted alcohol, especially during the high point of Prohibition. People wanted the freedom to drink, and it was being denied to them. And let's face it, I'm going to say this. If people want something, they're going to go to the person that's going to provide it for them. And some of those people were heroes because if you look at the law enforcement agencies, they were going after everyone who either had alcohol or was making alcohol. And, enough of that can cause people to really question law enforcement agencies, to really have, distrust towards the government. And when you have the criminal element providing that freedom, that liberty,
right,
that choice, people are going to gravitate towards that person. Plus, there's always that, and this is human beings in general. We are drawn to the person that challenges authority, that breaks the rules. And at one point, the criminal element had a lot of support. I wouldn't say like support, but I guess people were like, you know what? Good for you standing up to the system.
Yeah, because doing things the right way, doing things according to the system's needs. We were just talking about, how people had to build up their own bungalows, and everything was out of a Sears catalog, out of like a Woolworths catalog.
The original Amazon of its day.
The original Amazon of its day, Sears catalogs. It's why there's a Sears Tower in Chicago, because instead of paying people to build the city, if you wanted to live here, you have to build your own house. And a lot of what was normal in the system that worked for the capital class, that, people, it wasn't long before, that long ago that they were robber barons and the era that we're talking about. Someone like Al Capone that's standing up to the entirety of the system and creating an ecosystem of people actually being able to live a life, it's hard for people not to try to acquiesce to that. And it's why the Chicago outfit was able to stay underground from the 1930s. 1932, Al Capone was arrested well into the 1950s. Yeah. That's when the FBI came around and they're like, why are all of Al Capone's lieutenants
still around?
Still moving up in the world.
There's one other thing too I want to add on, and that is, looking at Al Capone and what he was providing. Look at the era he was in, the Depression, the 1930s.
Right.
If there were people who didn't have jobs, there were people who were out of work.
Sorry,
and
I want to back up. Actually, he
ahead.
was mostly active during the 1920s.
No, 1920s, right?
Yeah. So 1930s. Prohibition. That's he's in jail for most of the 1930s, but his operation is still is actually stronger than ever during the 1930s. So the only relief that a lot of working class people had was through connections to anyone from a union, from somebody that was more about self-preservation than the law of lands. Which I say all this to explain, and I bring in a lot of the Hollywoodness because this show is meant for a lot of our national Bernie supporting audience on social media. Adam Prime was here last week, talk about all the shows. A lot of people that are interested, if you're organizing in Tennessee, if you're organizing in Florida, if you're organizing in South Carolina, these are harder states to try to organize for a Democrat, let alone a socialist. I know a lot of people might be dissuaded. They're like, someone in Chicago is going to stop Bernie Sanders from being president. We're here to try to inform the public that a lot of organizers are trying to do what they can to not have the Chicago machine get ahead of that. Chicago machine is responsible for this very culture that is romanticized in Hollywood by Martin Scorsese. It's complicit in both the crimes, the elevated crimes that people live in fear of, and the punitive system that comes down on people that they also live in fear of. The Chicago machine is a machine of that conditions human beings, through law or not. It's what it is. It's built on power, these kind of power dynamics. And while we have been focusing a little bit on Chicago and the bigger, higher up players there, we'll get into the weeds, into the city. I want to focus specifically today on the township of Cicero, where Al Capone came out of, that is still an independent township, that is still shares train lines, bus lines with the city of Chicago, has a very symbiotic relationship. I lived right on the cusp of Cicero and Chicago. You really wouldn't tell that they're very different when you live that close to it. Yet the culture there, because it's a single township, because it has a single governmental unit, it is allowed to operate very much in the vein that is reminiscent of Al Capone's days. And for that, we've brought a very special guest, Esteban. Esteban, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm so happy that you continue talking about Cicero, right? I think that's one of my goals, to put Cicero on the map and solidify that it's not just a neighbor of Chicago, that it's also filled with working class people that needs to have a voice, right? So my name is Esteban. I am a longtime Ciceronian, and I've been part of the community and on the nonprofit sectors for a little bit under 14 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about our organization and where we're at.
For sure. And we want to hear about it because Esteban here has been very active in Cicero, which is quite rare, which is something that this show wants to support. We want to start a little bit about the history of Cicero's politics, though, starting with Betty Lawrence Maltese, former township president from 1993 to 2002, famously, well, you can tell the rest, right?
Yeah, so she was infamously known for her lawsuit that really brought her down. She was caught with insurance fraud, that she really took $12 million from the town of Cicero's taxpayers. At that time, I was nearly about 10 years old when that happened.
Yeah.
So that was my childhood. That was $12 million that could have gone towards lowering the crime, which in the 90s, especially in the north end of Cicero, it was flooded with gangs, violence, drugs. So those $12 million could have definitely done some good.
Yeah. It's interesting when you hear about because I remember her as well, and her entire career, she was trying to, especially when she first started off, she painted this image of herself as somebody who cared about the people of Cicero, who cared about her job. But always, a lesson that should be learned from everyone is that when you hear people talk like that, saying that, oh, I care about the people of so-and-so town, or I'm a good person, I know what I'm doing, I'm responsible, alarm bells should be ringing in your head, because she took $12 million of taxpayer money,
That we know of.
That is
course,
true. Yeah, that is true. That we know of,
Right.
and did whatever she wanted with it. It's just an example of corruption. No matter whether you're in the seats of power in Washington D.C. or if you had some sort of low-level county seat, corruption is everywhere, and
Right.
you gotta look at it. No matter who's in office, you gotta hold these people accountable. And she thought that she could get away with it.
Yeah, so she did that for nearly a decade, right? From 93 to 02.
Yeah. Racketeering, embezzling, insurance fraud, kind of low-level crimes that still help organized crime make, a bone here or there. Just wanted to reiterate Cicero, at least the highway of Cicero, especially over by where my folks might live, like by 47th Street, always known for streetwalkers and that kind of culture, which is why, I am a proponent of decriminalizing sex work, specifically because it is an industry, a perennial industry across all of human history, that we see up close in Cicero how it's controlled, and it's an abusive system, and has no recourse because if a escort is or a prostitute is mistreated by someone, they can't go to the police because it's a crime. That's how organized crime controls that industry. Union racketeering, though, it seems to be kind of a little bit bigger in Cicero than all that. And I don't know if you want to get a little bit into Betty's history after she went to jail.
Yeah. So she did 8 years in California state prison.
8 years. That's
yes.
not enough.
8 years and 1 month, I believe.
Oh, well, they added in that month. Okay, then I stand
Little
corrected.
cherry.
And I think part of the biggest things that she said during the hearings was that she was more concerned of her daughter that she adopted. At the time, I believe she was 5 years old. So, I mean, I understand the foster system. I know the trauma that the child received, but also all the traumas that the children in Cicero suffered during the time that she took all that money. Little bit after she went to prison, her successor, Ramiro Gonzalez, took over. So he was appointed for 2 years with the promise to really reform Cicero. He's a Latino. He's a known Republican. And within his 2-year time frame, he hired about a dozen of his home family. So that reform Cicero was really squashed. So going back to your point, Kit, of I'm here for the community. I mean, you have to really show a track record. So it's continued, right? We can really tail this all the way to Al Capone, Betty, Ramiro. So he lost the election to Larry Dominic, which is a topic of discussion for a little bit today.
Yeah.
He is our current town president. He's served already. He's on his 4th re-election, going up to 16 years next
16
year.
years now. Okay. I think we have a photo of Larry to share with the public here. Larry Dominic.
That's Betty right there.
Right. And current Cicero town president.
The other guy, I think.
No, that's him.
He's got a bit of a Rush Limbaugh vibe going on with Paulie from Goodfellas type of reputation. Yeah, Larry. You hear that name, and everyone does that face.
So 16 years, town president.
Next year.
So I just want to make it very clear, especially to anyone who's not from Chicago or Illinois or Cicero, we have a long, sad history of politicians on both sides that have been in office for more than 10 plus years, but like 50, 20, you're the highest person right now has been in office for like 50 plus years. That's an alderman in the 14th ward. So, I mean, it goes to show you that nepotism and political dynasties is something that's embedded in Illinois' DNA. So, I don't mean, but let's hear a little bit more about Larry and what's he doing?
Sure. So prior to being the town president, he was a police officer in the town of Cicero. So he has a long standing living condition in Cicero. So he's been there for a little bit over 50 years, I believe. Police officer turned town president, got into politics through the work and support of another individual, Jeffrey, and his attorney, Michael Delgado.
Right.
So
Before we get into Delgado, though, Larry got in with their help. And since he's gotten in, we've seen pretty up close how the elections go in Cicero. I don't know if you, a little bit about the turnout.
Yeah, so part of it is that so there is a political organization there that has been running the show for decades. It's called the Cicero Voters Alliance, and their purpose is really not sway Republicans or Democrats. That's why they unified the Cicero voters, right? So even though they're known Republicans, so they marketing themselves as an independent, bipartisan. So that way they get the voters on both ends. So the Cicero Voters Alliance have been there since 2005, and even prior to that, just organizing without the actual name. Their bet is for low voter turnout, right? So on average, is about maybe 6,000 votes for any election. When it comes to the general, they do ramp them up. A lot more people are interested and actually vote. So through that process, we 6,000 people on average, and
Yeah.
in the town populations is nearly 100,000 people.
6,000 people get to decide what 100,000 people
Yeah.
do. And before we move on, because we're going to spend a good amount of time on Delgado, because he ties into our favorite man, Michael Madigan. I think it's fair to just share with our viewership that a lot of these dynamics are why, despite Larry Dominic and a lot of his operation being nationally and partisanly Republican when it comes to their own bread and butter, they're nonpartisan, their machine, their Chicago machine, and with national Republicans who view this system, like to call the Chicago machine as communist. You essentially have a dictator, Larry Dominic, who has a lot of sway over a lot of city jobs. And if you want a city job and be in good standing and not be disturbed, certain things are expected from you, like not talking about certain things and always voting for the township. That's also the Chicago way, which is what that show really should be about. That show's terrible, but the Chicago way is is essentially that. It is creating a type of a working class fiefdom. Has been looked at with a lot of skepticism from the Republican Party, but when it's up close and when it's a township and when you're basically trying to control a community, people always go back to the same tried and true techniques. You control people's homes, you control how much food they have, or what kind of food they have, and how much time they have. And those restraints are enough to keep 100,000 people dispassionate and a little crestfallen, so that 6,000 people that have something good going for them can keep the operation going. I think, I just wanted to take that moment to look at that microcosm of Cicero, how it's always applied to Chicago, and ask our national viewers, does that not apply to your area as well? But Michael Delgado, right, let's talk about him. I think we have a photo of him, right?
Let's get to the next guy.
The guy behind the guy. So Larry Dominic. Been there for a very long time. Clearly knows how to get people to do things he wants them to do. But how do you keep an operation that big going? It's never just one guy. It's never just a small group. But you also need people that can connect you from groups to groups, power to power, and that person in Cicero is Michael Delgado. You want to go on a little bit about him?
Yeah, so as far as my knowledge and understanding, so he's the attorney that was brought in when Larry also came in on board, and ever since then he's really built a reputation as a political firm, where he not just represents Cicero but several other Chicago area and outside Cook County or in Cook County suburban.
You mentioned a couple of the townships. I believe perhaps Maywood.
Melrose Park,
Berwyn.
Yeah, and still ties with others, McCook, as well. Within those government entities, there's still the school boards and the school districts, right?
Mhm.
We're talking about Moreland College. We're talking about the high school districts. So it's a good paycheck that he gets.
Right.
I believe it's about $10 million a year.
$10 million.
$10 million.
Off of your kids' schools. And famously, former state rep Lou Lang, who was a deputy to Michael Madigan, has joined Michael Delgado's law firm.
Back in 18, I believe.
Back in 2018,
Yes,
right?
not
right.
too long ago.
Not too long ago. Delgado, no fool. He's empire building. He's extending his services across the region. Has found an ally that's closest to the highest levels of power in the state, Michael Madigan. Essentially, from organizing in Cicero for very little, but it seems like he's a much more prominent figure as the wheelings and dealings go than Larry is exactly.
Yeah, I think Larry is that picture, that face, but overall there's always that individual, the legal component, right?
Right.
So nothing goes through unless legal has approved it.
Wow.
And in this case, we definitely know that Delgado approves it
Ah.
or denies it. in many
Yeah.
cases.
Not
So-
too different from Al Capone's operation of
So
having
it's all
lawyers around the tough
interconnected.
guys.
It's all interconnected. It's one big neoliberal system, and we're not part of it. And it goes to show you why we need to get money out of politics, why we need to get involved in every single election cycle. I mean, let's just look at our most recent election cycle in the city of Chicago. Granted, the turnout was very low, but there was enough voters in certain key areas where now 5% of the city's council aldermen are like card-carrying members of Democratic Socialists of America. So hope can be achieved, political reform can be achieved. The key word, right, or the key thing we have to do is get people to be active and get involved at the municipal level so that we can bring in, progressives and independents that actually really do care about the community, that actually do want to step up and get involved, that actually want to end this corruption. And then this not only just goes with Chicago, but it's in Cicero, Berwyn, all over the state of Illinois, because the system can be beaten. It's nothing but a paper tiger surrounded by a paper wall. It's just the people themselves need to step up and stop relying on the crumbs from the top who are just giving it to us. I mean, these guys are just running loose on the entire political system here in Illinois. Democrat and Republicans within the establishment are just basically telling people, this is what we're going to offer you, this is what we're going to give you. People need to step up. People need to get involved and vote these people out of office. It can be done. We just got to stop being afraid and stop relying on them and the crumbs that they're giving us.
That's the $1 million question, right? Like, how do you get them engaged? It's a little bit more on Larry Dominic as we talk about it. Even though all the settlements have been paid off due to like sexual harassment and other FBI investigations, the hiring of even more people than his predecessor, Ramiro Gonzalez, he's hired more than nearly 20 individuals from his own family. So if that doesn't outrage the community, I don't know what's happening. They re-elected him 3 more times. So it's definitely an issue.
Yeah.
But we're working towards that.
And I think that's a good segue. I know we're a little early, but I think we can always bring in a lot of these people that we're talking about. Elections in Cicero are very tough. It's a very controlled system. It's a very opaque system. And yet you ran. You ran for school board.
I did.
Yeah. Want to tell us a little bit about that?
I did. It was an exciting process. It was definitely something I remember in clear daylight. So I ran for the school board for the 201 district, the Morin High School district. So that consists of 5 different high schools within Berwyn City, Stickney, and Lyons districts or neighborhoods. It was definitely a run for our money. We raised nearly $9,000 between myself and my co-candidate Edwin Robles, and so we were being opposed by the incumbents. So it was the best out of 3 win. So that means there was 5 candidates. You vote for your top 3 candidates, and those 3 win. I came 4th. My co-candidate came in 5th. But the shocking twist here is the money that they spent to beat us.
Right.
Right. So mind you that this is a volunteer position, right? There's no monetary support for me. It's just out of the goodness of my heart that I believe in the education system, that I want to be part of the solutions for our youth, right? And understanding that the same high school that I graduated is where I want to give back to. So they spent nearly $120,000 to beat us for a non-paid volunteer position, right?
$120,000
$120,000
for
according
school
to
board
Sunshine.
positions.
Well, sounds very. I mean, of
School
course,
board
of
stuff.
course, the price range sounds a little different, but I mean, let's just compare that to when Kasama Swant of Socialist Alternative, who was running for her councilwoman seat in Seattle, Amazon spent $1.5 million. Granted, Amazon's a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They spent that kind of money to stop her from getting in office, and they spent $120,000 to stop you from getting in office. What it says is that they are so afraid of losing any kind of power
Exactly.
that they are willing to spend any kind of money to silence any kind of change. It should motivate people to get involved. And to answer your $1 million question about how to get people actively involved, we got to have community organizations. We have to have community outreach, and we have to have people stop being afraid. And another thing too is sadly is that with stopping voter turnout is like, you got people working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet
Yeah.
in this city, and not only in the city but in this state. And there's a lot of problems in Illinois in general, and I think it's just communication. But I would take that with pride. They're willing to spend money, a big portion of money. They're afraid of you and what you can do.
I definitely take it with pride. I think, and we came close, right? So it was definitely a dent that we did for what little that we had. We definitely had the people power supporting us. None of them were paid. We had a lot of hundreds of volunteers really supporting us, even during the day of election. A lot of people called off of work because they believe in the cause. And part of the issue is that, yes, they do work their 2-3 jobs, but the thing is that the town of Cicero and Berwyn, Stickney and Lyons, they've never been door knocked before, right? So for them, is what's happening, what it is. It's a first experience that they're having. I can count hundreds of times. We've knocked thousands of houses, and out of those, many of them were shocked that somebody would actually care to knock at their door, because for decades that has not been the process. Nobody has ever door knocked for any candidate.
Right.
So it was definitely something to cherish, and 120 versus 9,000 is
No, most
big
definitely.
difference.
There was a good documentary made on it.
We did. One of our so there was a freelance journalist from Northwestern. He was a student. He was doing his senior project. Through that process, he really liked our story and decided to make a documentary. So he followed us from day one all the way to election day, and even post. He's still an active member. He now resides in Cicero because he believes he loves Cicero now because of it. So we were able to sell him Cicero. So Across the Board is the name of the documentary. It was a Emmy awarded documentary in the Chicago Midwest region. So it was definitely something that we're excited and passionate for.
That's also what it's called, Across the Board. This is the first time hearing about it. I actually want to see this.
Across the Board, it's a 26-minute a documentary. I'm still shooting or budging him all the time to release it. He's still trying to put it out at other sources.
Right.
We do have screenings every once in a while, and just the time we do screen it, it evokes passion in everybody who watches it.
Spread the message. Tell him
Yeah.
to be sharing it all over
Check it
Cicero.
out.
Maybe put it back in the Chicago area. Make it something that everyone can see here, because I think when people see something that can be done, when something can be achieved, I mean,
Exactly.
it motivates people to step and get involved. Look, AOC was at one point, the media paid her no attention. She was a bartender, and she was going up against Crowley, Nancy Pelosi's successor, right? And she beat Crowley, and Crowley, being the egomaniac that he was trying to write a song about his victory, but then infamously played a song congratulating AOC, and he was still in the
That was
race
so weird.
again with the Workers' Family Party, and then even then was all of that in the general election, AOC won. So it should motivate people that no matter what office you're running for in the state of Illinois, victory can be achieved. Like, stuff can be achieved. People need to see this happen. So make that documentary. Make sure it's in every single theater playing in Chicago.
definitely.
Make it happen,
And
dude.
shout out to AOC. Her victory in New York definitely
Yeah.
kept a lot of us here in Chicago going in the movement.
Yeah.
It was a hard year, 2018.
Yeah.
You ran, you lost, but you are still standing on a whole lot. When you say we, I wanted to plug in your group, the Rizoma Collective. I think we have their logo that I wanted to share. The Rizoma Collective, it seems like it's a great group of people. I've met with you guys, a couple times, throughout this year. A lot of good community organizing in Cicero, a lot of young people. I really appreciate how you were supportive of the people that are going away to school, how they still want to stay involved.
Exactly.
You have a documentary filmmaker who is sharing stories in Cicero that no one that's in the official government of power, wants to elevate these stories. An aspect I want to touch on before we leave is who makes up the government and who actually lives in Cicero. It just seems like you're actually community building with Rizoma. You ran, you did a really hard thing. You had power try to show you what power is all about, and it seems like you guys are standing stronger than ever.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. I think we often work too much to the point where we don't hear these things, so it's always enlightening to hear that. And I think that's part of the issue that our communities, individuals run with very progressive and saying that they're going to change and doing for their families, but the second they lose, they walk away, right? And they don't continue any movement that they had or any traction. So that's been the issue for us. Several candidates that's run for town presidents against Larry have vanished the moment after their election loss. But what we did is different, right? We literally capitalized on the volunteer and the energy and the youth that were part of our campaigns to really create an organization out of it. So for the past 7 months after our election, we've have met every single Monday for 2 hours each week, between maybe 20 to 40 individuals who share the same passion, interest, and have really taken this as their own investment, right? So Rizoma Collective is an independent political organization that's really focused in our communities, the town of Cicero and Berwyn. Within that, and the name is very even significant too, right? It's the idea of a rhizome, so it's a translation in English to rhizome, which is a type of root. And comparing a grass root versus a rhizome root is quite different. The grass root is very vertical, right, where the point where the stem just goes up. A rhizome actually grows horizontally, right? So it's an even playing field that the community should be at even and eye to eye with the elected officials.
And I love that you guys also decided to start with school board, one of the most, you know, one of the lowest tiers of like what government officials could really be in charge of, but also one of the most personal. These are your schools, these are the youth, and you're active with the youth. The youth, these are college students, these are high school students are that going into college. These are, people in their early to mid 20s, and that's the future of Cicero. They have roots there. They have plans. They're going to grow old in that community, and they're organizing now. I think that is also why they're throwing so much money to try to squash that. But school board specifically, I think I wanted to center in just what the position does. You're in charge of of the school culture, of what the student body gets to see, of what what you want them to be empowered with or not. And they didn't want someone that they couldn't control in charge of that. Like, why is that?
I think that's really the point, right? Contracts are made. There is under the table conversations behind closed doors. So there's definitely financial conflicts. The reason why they're throwing all this money to really not have us there. So it's ultimately a school board at a local base, which is good, right? Because in Chicago, we don't have elected school boards. And I think in many conversations, that's where some groups are going towards or interested in having. So an elected school board, their real goal or emphasis is to relay the community's feedback towards the superintendent and making sure that policies are in place, making sure that the financial stability of the school board or the school district is well off, that there's no other reasons why they should be questioned. They do have a huge impact in taxes as tax levies are made. 25% of our taxes come from schools, right? So it makes sense to engage the community at least in that area.
Wow,
as
$10
we
million
were,
can accumulate pretty quick.
I mean, if as I was door knocking and the rest of us, some individuals just not interested in the high school board, and their own reason was I don't have a kid anymore. They're old, and so I already lost that battle right away as soon as he mentioned that or they mentioned that. But then I try to re-engage that conversation, saying, well, you're still a taxpayer, right? So keeping them engaged, even though it's not the important for them, they still care because at the end of the day, they're paying a fourth of their taxes towards that board.
Towards that board, towards education, so something so fundamental that they should be seeing good results in society from. Not what we usually get in Chicago, but
I think it's also important that people realize that they do have power, that they do have a voice, and I think we just need to be reminded. I think for a long time we've heard from the media and the establishment, and sometimes occasionally somebody making a joke like, "Oh, your vote doesn't matter. It never did." When you give up your right to vote, when you say, "I'm not going to get involved. I'm not going to, participate in any kind of election. I'm not going to cast my vote," you're basically throwing away your power. You're not designing the menu. You're now the meal, and
Good
you
call.
made yourself an easy target, and you've basically given legitimate authority to anyone who is corrupt to continue doing what they're doing, And let's look back at human history. Have we ever just sat by and let somebody just continue to be corrupt? No, people need to step up and get involved. And I think now with Bernie Sanders, especially, I remember when he was when he came to CTU and rallied all the Chicago
Rank and
Teachers
file
Union.
was excited
I mean,
that day.
that was the straw
I
that
wasn't
broke the
there.
camel's back. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, and because for a long time CTU was being ignored by previous mayoral administrations, and people had it up to here. And hearing it from Bernie Sanders that it is okay to step up and fight back, people need to remember that it's okay to step up and fight back and deal with these corrupt officials. All what they are is like right now they're just used to being in their little paper wall that's protecting them.
Right.
We just can push it over.
We gotta tear
It
that
can
down.
happen.
And I wanted to plug that in. Thank you for mentioning Bernie Sanders. This, again, is for a national audience. Please register to vote. Please register to vote and organize for Bernie Sanders. All the powerful people, as you can hear, our system may be corrupt. It may be fungible. It may be able to be rigged. But they wouldn't be spending this much money or expending that much energy if there wasn't a possibility that the results show the collective opinion of the public that our laws must adhere to in a democracy. A democracy, a representative republic, democracy. I think we need more democracy and less corrupt representation. $120,000 they spent on winning a school board race. Bloomberg just dropped, I think, how much did he drop? Millions of dollars? It was as much as Kamala Harris has spent altogether.
I think it's like $10 to $15 million.
$15 million
But
he
granted, I
already spent.
stand corrected, but
Right.
just remember
Yeah.
that money went to the Democratic Party.
Right.
It's going to go to the incumbents. It's not going to go to progressives or independents that are
Right.
running.
He spent all that money to buy this election. He can spend maybe $2-3 billion. That's what Clinton spent. $3 billion. He won his New York race by spending 5 times the amount that his opponent did. So he could spend a good $15 billion of his $70 billion and still win the presidency. The tax that Bernie Sanders, the tax plan, the wealth tax that Bernie Sanders is trying to implement, also Elizabeth Warren, would be much more money that Michael Bloomberg loses than what he would spend to become president. And that money being taxed by him means it goes to you, the public, for public goods. By him wanting to spend his money on a private organization for that power to control where that money goes, it means he doesn't care about you. Number one, you knew that. But also, he's going to take more money from you. I mean, $120,000 to win a school board seat, there's so many trappings to take some money here and there within the school board. I'm guessing that whoever got into the seat with those $120,000 is going to make more than that much money for the people helping them.
Yeah.
I mean,
And not to mention, too, with Bloomberg, he's got his good friend Jeff Bezos,
Yeah.
the owner of Amazon. Amazon that pays 0 in taxes, mind you. That's something we got to remember about Jeff Bezos.
Oh.
And Bloomberg is getting his support. And just a quick reminder, too, about Bloomberg, who's a Republican. It was a mayor of New York as a Republican. And yet he's in a Democratic primary. But yet we hear from the DNC that Bernie Sanders isn't a Democrat, so we can't support him. But it's okay to support the Republican that's in a Democratic primary.
Right.
Good job, DNC.
I do
Well
want to
done.
bring this back to Cicero, but most
Yeah.
importantly, and also pertinent to Cicero, Michael Bloomberg was extremely active in Chicago politics this decade, leaving the New York mayoralship. He made New York into he really cleaned up New York, I think was a common phrasing in urban planning circles. That they said, he made it to a real true global city, or reified it as a global city in Chicago, always shaking and quivering, wanting to be just as important in New York. Invited him over, and he's gotten, the soda tax Tony Preckwinkle implemented came from him. He was unable to implement in New York, didn't work out in Chicago. He had a lot of brilliant urban planning ideas for making this city a global city for a playground for the rich. And he feels obligated, he feels entitled to world building your society. I can't imagine Delgado and Larry Dominic are all that much different, and what they believe their role in Cicero is.
Yeah, I don't either. It's surprising. I think part of the general conversation, and bringing this back to the other conversation that we just had, excuse me, is the idea that for enough time that a community has been left untouched, unserved, unheard, that even elected officials do not touch that or do not even bother even working in that area. So I think it's more of a call to action that for all elected officials that represent any neighborhood, and for me specifically, my own selfish interest is the town of Cicero, Berwyn, for anybody that represents those neighborhoods, for you to okay, I get it. Maybe in the past nobody ever kept you accountable, and that's fair, right? You have maybe other issues and other things that to take care of, but now there's an organization that's going to hold people accountable, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully that they know that we're not here to just play games with them. We want to be heard, and this goes beyond just elected officials.
Yeah.
We're talking about nonprofits as well, CBOs. They have people power in itself, and if they stay quiet, also they're just part of the problem, part of the same situation. So
Yeah.
I think if in general, if we were all to just get together, work together, we all serve the same people. Nonprofits in general, they have the same issues that we're trying to fight as Rizoma Collective. So it only makes sense that if we all combine our efforts and people power, that there can be a voice echoed.
Thank you. And I mean, I think it's very reminiscent of what this decade saw in the neighborhood of Pilsen, with the Pilsen Alliance, seeing a new director, Byron Singh Cho, eventually continually to challenge the alderman there, Alderman Solis, run, lose, but continue building and run again. Now he is the sitting alderman in the 25th Ward. Pilsen Alliance worked very diligently to hold Danny Solis accountable, to combat what the local media narrative of him was, to push back against the nonprofit industrial complex that was giving support to Danny Solis, to the point where Danny Solis's ouster for wearing from office on corruption charges, and being caught being revealed to have been wearing a wire on other notions of the Chicago machine. It was a narrative that was tried to be cleaned up a little bit. It was tried to portray him as some kind of heroic figure and trying to take on other corrupt officials. He was really just a man over a barrel. And because of consistent organizing that, of him being held accountable, there's a very different narrative in the neighborhoods, and there's a much different opportunity now, and I hope that we see that mimicked and mirrored in Cicero, because it's definitely a township that, and Berwyn, that warrants that.
Yeah, I feel like there's already some mimicking it. If we're talking about wire typing or tapping and FBI rigs, right? So Martin Sandoval, who
Yeah.
also represents a portion of Cicero, just resigned or stepping down at the end of the year, right? So, and that's just the ripple effect. Surrounding neighborhoods have been rated as well in Summit, certain businesses as well. So it's just a matter, I just constantly look at the news, seeing maybe if the next FBI raid is in the town hall of Cicero. That would be great.
That would be historic. But just
I
a
hope
quick
so.
short note. I really enjoyed interviewing Byron, especially when when we first interviewed him. He was an activist with Pilsen Alliance, and it's been incredible to see just what kind of work Pilsen Alliance has done and Byron has done in regards to, dealing with the corruption. I know it's a monumental task, but it can be achieved. Victory can be achieved.
It takes a lot of consistent work, and I think that the fact that you have so much youth, so many people meeting consistently to keep that going, is much bigger than the neighborhood of Pilsen had, but you're taking a whole township.
Yeah.
A lot of history.
Believe it or not, I'm the oldest. I'm 31 years old. That means that we have a big group of 24-year-olds and younger. So I'm just hopeful that the next 10, 15 years from now, it's going to be a whole different dynamic.
And let's hope so. I mean, just the fact that you have young people that are willing to challenge the power and are looking at these FBI raids and are agitational about the news that comes out of them to try to dig more instead of just laying it lay low and hoping it blows over the way that historically Chicago has kind of operated, I think is going to lead to greater results in and of itself. So I think it's great that you guys are organizing.
As it should.
Before we sign off, I didn't know if you wanted to plug in anything from Rizoma.
Yeah, I think just in general, we're still organizing. We meet on a monthly basis. The next meeting is January 14th at the Berwyn Public Library at 6:30 p.m. to 8. We're, again, continuing now our recruitment efforts where It's a membership base, so they have a say and they have a buy-in as well. January 14th, Berwyn Public Library. Anybody is welcome. We believe in complete transparency, community, and social justice. So thank you so much for hosting us and having me.
Thank you, Esteban. Thank you again, Kit. Thank you for tuning in to Fear and Loathing in the Windy City. Chicago has a long, dark history of corruption, controlling power at the highest levels, and obfuscating so much from the public in order so that the powerful that live and play here can better control you. We hope to keep bringing on guests and illuminating stories of different topics that we think the general public should know about. Please research these people on your own. Please give us ideas on what else you would like to know about Chicago politics, and let's elect Bernie Sanders to be president in 2020. Thank you.
All right.